internet. Today I am here to do my wrap up for the month of May. I read 9 books in May, which is the most that I've read so far this year in 1 month, so I'm super excited about it. And actually quite a bit of those reads were rereads for me too. I did a lot of rereading this month because 4 of those 9 books were rereads, and I loved all of the ones that I reread. I had a pretty good reading month. A lot of 5 stars and 4 stars. There was one book that I really didn't particularly care for, but we're gonna get into that. So without further ado, let's jump into the books I read. So the very first book I read in May was A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab, and this was one of my rereads. This is one of my absolute favorite series of all time, and I am excited to be rereading it. I knew that this was something that I definitely wanted to give a reread this year, this series, and I listened to this one on audio, which was a new way of taking in the book for me, and the audiobook was very, very good. For those of you who somehow missed out on the memo of the series, A Darker Shade of Magic is the first book in the Shades of Magic trilogy, and it's about a guy named Kel who is one of the very last people in this world who is able to travel in between worlds. So for example, this story takes place in London, and there are actually 4 different Londons because there are 4 different worlds. And so he's one of the only 2 people left that are able to do this. And also, since he is able to do this, he kind of gets involved in some smuggling, which is, you know, obviously illegal. And on one of his trips into one of the Under Londons, he runs into a thief named Delilah Bart, and chaos ensues. Like I said, this is one of my favorite series of all time. I'm super excited to be reading it, and obviously I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I did participate in one readathon this past month, which was the Buzzword readathon, and I only completed 1 book during that readathon, which was The Girls by Emma Cline. This novel, I guess it's kind of a historical fiction novel. It's about a girl named Evie who gets involved in this cult that's very, very similar to Charles Manson's cult back in the 60s. This takes place in the 60s, so it's almost like a reimagining of that whole situation, and I did not like it. I really wanted to like this book. This book was really, really popular when it came out back in, I want to say 2016. So I had high hopes for it, but I didn't care for it. I expected this book to be more about the cult and the murders that would happen, and it really just wasn't. It was more about Evie's home life, and it also had this weird like time jump in between the 60s when all this was going on and like a later time. And I just didn't feel like that flowed super well. And so ultimately I just kind of got bored with it. My mind was wandering a lot when I was listening to this. I really just didn't care for it. I was super interested in the premise, but just not a fan of the end product with this one. I only gave it 2.5 stars. This one just wasn't for me. Next, I finished up one of my most anticipated books of the year, and that was Obsidio by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is the 3rd and final book in the Illuminae Files trilogy, and it follows the same format that the other 2 books have, kind of that multimedia format, and it kind of ties the other 2 books together. It goes into what happens after Gemina. And all of the characters from the first 2 books kind of come together in this one, and I thought it was a pretty good finale. Although I will say I think that this is my least favorite of the trilogy. It just didn't feel like it had the same intensity until like the last third of it as the first 2 books did. Although one really cool thing about this book, and I've mentioned this on my channel before, is my name's actually in it because I won a contest at a Gemina sighting for my name to be on a list. So there's my name, which was super cool to stumble upon when reading. But yeah, this one was my least favorite, although I still really, really enjoyed it. And I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I finished a book that I have been reading for a long time, and that was A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. So I started listening to this in the last couple of days of December last year on audio, and I finally finished it this month. I listened to this one on audiobook. I'm glad I did it that way, and I want to listen to the rest of the series on audio, but the thing that I did that I wish I would have done a little differently, and the reason this took me so long to read is that the audiobook is just so long, and there were so many other audiobooks that were coming into my queue on Overdrive that I would prioritize other audiobooks over this one and then just listen to this one a little bit at a time. And like, that was fine, and I got the full story and everything, but I think going forward I'm going to try and listen to these in less time, because I really did enjoy this first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. It really got me excited to read the rest of the series. And actually, I think after I finish reading the series, I'm going to rewatch the entire TV show. I'm hoping to be able to get all of this done before the last season comes out next year, because I absolutely love the TV show, and I know that the last couple of seasons veer away from the books because they ran out of books, but I do want to read the books as well because I really enjoyed this first one, and I also really liked the narrator of the audiobooks. I thought he did a really good job. So I'm glad that I finally was able to get this book read. I feel really excited to finally start this series because it's one I've been wanting to start for many years, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read another one of my most anticipated books of the year, and that was Leah on the Offbeat by Becky Albertalli. So this is a YA contemporary that's kind of a companion sequel to Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda, and I really loved this book. I do think out of Becky's 3 books, this is my least favorite, but I still thoroughly enjoyed it. So this one follows Leah, who is one of Simon's best friends. And Leah is a drummer in an all-girl band and a senior in high school. This is all of the characters' senior year in this book. And Leah is also hiding the fact that she is bisexual. She hasn't really told anybody in her friend group. The only person that really knows is her mom. And so that is something that she deals with throughout the book. But I enjoyed kind of just seeing where all these different characters were going, especially since it is their senior year and kind of their plans for after graduating high school. This does not end with them graduating high school, it kind of ends right before. And it was just like a fun, quick read, which is exactly what I was in the mood for, and exactly what one of the things that I love about Becky's books is they're always just really fun, they put you in a good mood, they're really just like happy-go-lucky, and they're quick reads. And the only thing that I kind of got annoyed with this one is sometimes Leah's attitude was just really kind of irritating. She was not my favorite of the main characters from all of Becky's books, but I still thoroughly enjoyed this one. I highly recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next was another reread for me, and that was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is one of the books in the Chronicles of Narnia series, which is why I'm holding this up, because I just have a bind up of all of them. So depending on how you read these books, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in publication order is the first book, and in chronological order is the second book. This one was a reread for me, and I listened to the audiobook, and it was fantastic. Whenever I read these books back in the day, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was my favorite, and I am in the midst of rereading these books and then reading the 2 books that I never read, which is The Silver Chair and The Last Battle. I never read those as a kid for whatever reason. So I'm in the midst of that reread. So far I read The Magician's Nephew and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe because I'm reading them in chronological order. But anyway, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was my favorite book back in the day, and I really enjoyed listening to the audiobook for this one. The narrator did a great job, and I just loved being re-immersed into the world of Narnia. So I'm really enjoying my reread of that. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and I can't wait to keep continuing on with my Narnia rereads. Next was another reread for me, and that was Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince by J.K. Rowling. If you have been watching my channel for a little bit, you know that I've been rereading the Harry Potter series very slowly. And the last few I've listened to the audiobook for, so this one became available this month to me, and I dove right in. I have been so enjoying rereading this series. It's obviously my favorite series of all time. And there were some things in this one that, again, I completely forgot about, particularly some of the memories that Harry and Dumbledore see in the Pensive. I had forgotten that, I mean, I knew that those happened, but I'd forgotten a lot of the details, and so it was really fun kind of revisiting that, because I don't think I've reread this one since around the time that the movie came out. I'm pretty sure. So it's been a long time. But again, super enjoying this reread. I'm down to the Deathly Hallows. which makes me kind of sad, and then I'm just gonna have to reread them again, I guess. But and I'm really enjoying the audiobooks. Jim Dale does a wonderful job with this series, and obviously I gave it 5 out of 5 stars because duh. Next, I listened to the audiobook for The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert, and this was a pretty enjoyable read. This book is about a girl named Alice whose grandmother is famous for having written this book of like really creepy fairy tales, and Alice has never actually met her grandmother. Her and her mother have they move a lot. They move like multiple times a year, and then her and her mother find out that her grandmother died, and all of a sudden her mother's been kidnapped, and so Alice goes to try and find her, and she ends up having to go into the world that her grandmother created, which turns out to be real. This book was not what I expected, but I really liked what it was. So I was expecting this book to be mostly fantasy and set more in the hinterland, which is the fantasy world, than it was. It was mostly set in our world, and it was more of kind of like a mystery, and they don't really go into the hinterland until about 2/3 of the way through the book. But for me that was fine, it just wasn't what I was expecting. But do know that going in, because I have seen where some people were kind of bothered by that. But I really enjoyed this. It kind of reminded me of Once Upon a Time in a way, just because it's fairy tale and fairy tale characters that some of which are in the real world, but then there's like a hidden fairy tale world within the real world kind of thing. So it gave me those kind of vibes, which I really enjoyed because I love Once Upon a Time. But the tales in this one, we don't hear a lot of the fairy tales, we only get some of them, but they were really creepy, and I would love to read a book of just these fairy tales, which I think she's writing, so I'm really excited about that. There is one very problematic scene though that I wanted to mention, and it's not really a spoiler at all, but there is a part where Alice and the other kind of main character, Finch, who is a person of color, get pulled over by a cop, and Alice really says some nasty things to the cop and really starts to aggravate him, and it makes Finch super uncomfortable as a person of color. And then when Finch says something to Alice later about, hey, did you not think about the fact that that could have been bad with me being here, that could have been bad for me, and Alice really just kind of blows him off and doesn't really seem to give a shit to what he's saying. And I feel like what the author was trying to do was show how that is bad and point that out, but I don't think it was done very well. It bothered me, and I think it could have been handled a lot better if she was going to include something like that. It didn't really feel like it was needed at all, but she needed to handle that way better than it was. I don't really know how else to explain it, but it was just not handled well. But yes, I really enjoyed this. I don't know how I feel about there being a sequel, because I feel like this sits really well as a standalone, but I will probably read the sequel because I enjoyed the first book. And I ended up giving it 4 stars. And the very last book that I read in the month of May was The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas. So I have decided that I am going to reread the Throne of Glass series before the last book comes out in October, Kingdom of Ash. Because these books are so big and so much happens, that there's a lot that I don't remember because I read them 2 years ago, and also I haven't read Tower of Dawn yet, for kind of the same reason. So I've decided to reread this series. It's one of my favorite series of all time, and I decided this time to start with The Assassin's Blade, which this book right here is 5 prequel novellas that happened before Throne of Glass. So since I'm rereading it, I decided to start with this book. But I will say, if you have never read the Throne of Glass series, do not start with The Assassin's Blade. Read Throne of Glass first, and I wouldn't read The Assassin's Blade until either after Crown of Midnight or Heir of Fire, as long as you read it before Queen of Shadows, which is the 4th book. Since I'm rereading it and I know the basic story, I decided to start here and then dive into Throne of Glass next. But I really enjoyed being back in this world and reading about Selena, and I'm just really excited to be rereading these books. I obviously gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and I'm really excited to continue my reread of this series. So I know that was super duper long. If you powered through it, thanks for that. But let me know down in the comments what you thought of the books that I read, and I will see you guys next time with another video. Bye.